Welcome to Sky Gazing. This is your host, Gayatri. I have been reading The Light of Asia, the poem that defined the Buddha by Jairam Ramesh, which is research into the life of the poet of the original Light of Asia, Edwin Arnold, the context in which he wrote the poem, the deep influence it came to have upon a great many thinkers, writers, and leaders of our time, from Swami Vivekananda to Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, Oppenheimer, and a study of the poem itself in the sense of where it stands in history, what it means, and what it meant. For those of you who haven't already read The Light of Asia, I would recommend you first read the original poem before you come to this work. For those of you who haven't read it already, I'm just going to read a little bit. Let's start with that. Over here, the Buddha is stopping an animal sacrifice, and he speaks of the value of life. But Buddha softly said, "Let him not strike, great king," and therewith loose the victim's bonds, none staying him, so great his presence was. Then craving leave he spake of life, which all can take but none can give, life which all creatures love and strive to keep, wonderful, dear, and pleasant unto each, even to the meanest, yea, a boon to all, where pity is, for pity makes the world soft to the weak and noble for the strong. Unto the dumb lips of his flock he lent sad pleading words, showing how man who prays for mercy to the gods is merciless, being as God to those, albeit all life is linked in kin, and what we slay have given meek tribute of the milk and wool, and set fast trust upon the hands which murder them. Also he spake of what the holy books do surely teach, how that at death some sink to bird and beast, and these rise up to man in wanderings of the spark which grows purged flame. So were the sacrifice new sin, if so the fated passage of a soul be stayed. Nor spake he, shall one wash his spirit clean by blood, nor gladden gods being good with blood, nor bribe them being evil, nay, nor lay upon the brow of innocent bound beasts one hair's weight of that answer all must give, for all things done amiss or wrongfully, alone each for himself, reckoning with that the fixed arithmic of the universe, which meeteth good for good and ill for ill, measure for measure, unto deeds, words, thoughts, watchful, aware, implacable, unmoved, making all futures fruits of all the past. Thus spake he, breathing words so piteous with such high lordliness of ruth and right. The priests drew back their garments o'er the hands, crimson with slaughter, and the king came near, standing with clasped palms, reverencing Buddha, while still our Lord went on, teaching how fair this earth were if all living things be linked in friendliness and common use of foods, bloodless and pure, the golden grain, bright fruits, sweet herbs which grow for all, and waters wan, sufficient drinks and meats, which when these heard the might of gentleness so conquered them, the priests themselves scattered their altar flames and flung away the steel of sacrifice, and through the land next day passed a decree proclaimed by criers, and in this wise graved on rock and column, thus the king's will is, there hath been slaughter for the sacrifice and slaying for the meat, but henceforth none shall spill the blood of life nor taste of flesh, seeing that knowledge grows and life is one, and mercy cometh to the merciful. So ran the edict, and from those days forth, sweet peace hath spread between all living kind, man and the beasts which serve him, and the birds, on all those banks of Gunga where our Lord taught with his saintly pity and soft speech. This was a passage from book the 5th, if I'm not mistaken, of the 5th of the original poem, The Light of Asia. And one of the reasons also why I ask you to read it before you come to reading Mr. Jairam Ramesh's scholarly work on the work, is because you sort of understand the tone, or it's a very Christian tone, our Lord, saintliness, and for instance where he says, there are lines where he says the merciful will be shown mercy. These are very biblical, Matthew, I think chapter 5 verse 7, echoes of the Bible and the entire Christian upbringing, which as you read Ramesh's work, you will find that he beautifully places context of how there was this sort of questioning of Christianity by Edwin Arnold, by his contemporaries, people like Matthew Arnold, and a move away from the biblical interpretations, which, while that is true, from the Indic sense, when you read The Light of Asia, it is an extremely Christian work, because if you know any Buddhist monks at all, or have any training in Buddhism, you understand that the Buddha did not seek reverence, or he did not ask you to pay homage in those terms. He very much presented himself as a man, and the monks take him as a man. He asks that he be questioned, and this sort of saintly light in which he is cast, our Lord, the merciful. The Buddha doesn't give mercy, that's not his role, and he was very clear and pragmatic about that in his life and in his works. Having said which, therefore it's necessary to read this. If anything, the poem reminds me more of Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, which has a similar sort of canonization of the glory of an individual acting in a divine way. So poems that you might want to read for context, and definitely do also read the original Lalita Vistara Sutra, which I believe is one of the sources for his work. It's also written in the form of an epic sutra poem. You'll find a beautiful translation on 84,000.co. Okay. So I would recommend that you read all these sources before you come to this, because it gives you a context of how the perception of the Buddha sort of evolved at this period in time through this poem. It's also important to keep in mind, that that is not the only perspective of the Buddha, because there were simultaneous translations into Sanskrit, into Tibetan, into Pali, into regional languages of the Buddhist sutras. It traveled to Sri Lanka right from the 2nd century, to Japanese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. So there are various aspects of the Buddha, and this is one of them. It's necessary to keep that in mind. To my mind, it's very westernized, so as much as Arnold, I feel, believed he was traveling away from a positing a counter to the monotheistic linearity of the church, he very much remains in that framework, though he thinks he doesn't, which is what Ramesh sort of captures. So it's important to read the poem in the original. Also, my one pet peeve with Ramesh's work is his use of the term mutiny for the Indian War of Independence, or the Rebellion of 1857. I find it too irksome to sort of find it repeating, and though he does give you an author's note in which he says he retains it because Arnold used the term, I think it was unnecessary to keep repeating it in a space which is not directly citing Arnold. And I do find a couple of typos and grammatical omissions, a bit of poor editing here and there, a missing to, a the that was required, an article, that kind of thing. But overall, the book is beautifully produced. Do remember, this is just to give you an introduction to the book. So, of course, you should go to the book, you should read it, you should make up your own mind about it. I'll just be reading selected excerpts that I found interesting to whet your appetite. Consider this a sort of asynchronous book club. Please do engage with the book on your own. Of course, I appreciate shares, comments, social media posts. I'm sure it will benefit the book also. And just try not to tag the author if your comment is not favorable, because I think that's just a bit rude. All right. So let's look at why did Edwin Arnold, who would also head the Deccan College and who worked in public service, who returned to England a number of times, was born to landed gentry, editor of the Daily Telegraph, had an illustrious career himself. Why was he writing the life of the Buddha? For that, let me just read an excerpt from the middle of the book somewhat, that is around page 81. I have spoken about how different scholars have tried to locate the sources of the Light of Asia. Some have pointed to the influence of English translations of Pali texts or the influence of French translations of Sanskrit texts. Let us not forget that Arnold was an extraordinarily well-read man, a man who had spent over 2 years in an atmosphere of intense Sanskrit learning in India. He would also have had a sense of the oral traditions of the life of the Buddha, such as they existed in mid-19th century Western India. Before the Light of Asia, he had translated the Gita Govinda, which depicted the Buddha as the 9th incarnation of Vishnu. And I cannot believe that a student of Sanskrit poetry, Arnold would not have been familiar with Ashvaghosha's Buddha Charita, an epic of great stylistic flourish composed in Sanskrit sometime in the 1st century CE. So it was that in 1879 the Light of Asia came to be. One Indian who would later be hailed as the father of the nation was 10 years old then. Another Indian who was to be his designated political heir would be born 10 years later. The Light of Asia was published exactly midway between the births of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. The year 1879 was also when one of India's most gifted English poets, Sarojini Naidu, was born. In 1896, she would hail Arnold and Alfred Austin as rare geniuses and true poets. In 1905, her anthology, The Golden Threshold, would be published in London, in which the very last poem was called To a Buddha Seated on a Lotus. This would be included in the voluminous The Oxford Book of English Mystical Verse, 1917, that also had sections from the book The Eighth of the Light of Asia. Sarojini Naidu would be the only Indian in the collection. Strangely, Rabindranath Tagore, who had by then won the Nobel Prize for Literature, does not figure in it. In September 1882, Arnold would write the preface to his Pearls of the Faith, a poem extolling the 99 names of Allah. He had just completed a hugely successful visit to America, and so this book would come out in early 1883 with a dedication to the many friends in America, known and unknown, of the author of the Light of Asia. In the preface to the Pearls of the Faith, Arnold would explain, I have thus at length finished the Oriental trilogy which I designed in my Indian Song of Songs. I sought to transfer to English poetry subtle and lovely Sanskrit idyll of the Hindu theology. In my Light of Asia, I related the story and displayed the gentle and far-reaching doctrines of that great Hindu prince who founded Buddhism. I have tried to present here the simple, familiar and credulous, but earnest spirit and manner of Islam, and from its own points of view, some of the thoughts and beliefs of the followers of the famous prophet of Arabia. This is the most straightforward explanation of why the Light of Asia came to be written. It is interesting that Arnold takes Gita Govinda as the Hindu pick for his trilogy and regards Islam as very much an Indian religion. 2 years later, his The Song Celestial or Bhagavad Gita would be published, which would make him even more of a name among the educated Hindu communities. This book, like the Light of Asia, would immortalize him, but Arnold did not consider it part of his trilogy. Another reason for the Light of Asia would be revealed many years later in 1942 by Arnold's son. By then, Julian Arnold was running 79 and had written a book of recollections of famous people he had met over the decades. According to him, his father wrote The Light of Asia to unwind and to get his mind off politics, and to uncurl his brain when he came home after writing thundering editorials and articles on what the British should be doing on the confrontation between Russia and Turkey. Julian Arnold recalled, "It would be difficult to select literary tasks more dissimilar than the cares of a wartime editor, and the writing in epic form of a clear and wondrously colourful exposition of the metaphysics of Buddha. Like a mountain torrent, he forcefully aided to sweep from his country's course all impediments, then changing to the mood of a poet, passed to levels where thought formed pools in the deep calm of which the eternal hills were mirrored. Too pent with intellectual energies to desire rest, he deliberately chose a counterbalance to his daily work so different in its nature that it served as a relaxation." Julian Arnold went on to also provide his remembrance of how his father wrote his immortal poem. Nor was the method of writing The Light of Asia less remarkable than the time chosen for its inception. He would jot down in train or carriage or wheresoever he happened to be a few lines as they came to him, using any scrap of paper at hand, such as margins of newspapers he had been reading, or the insides of envelopes, or the back of his menu card at dinner. At home, in the evenings, he would write long passages, undisturbed by the conversation around him. Those fragmentary writings he assembled into a book which he called his brick pile, and after he had revised, expanded, and polished its contents, he copied the whole into another book. That final manuscript passed on to his publishers as the harmonious and connected poem we know as The Light of Asia. One of the reasons why this is such a remarkable sort of insight into how he wrote this poem is quite literally the poem itself, because which is why I insist that you read the poem before you read this book. For instance, if you go into book the first, you have this passage where what Arnold writes is just pure knowledge, the kind that very few of us have about Hindu philosophy, Vedic philosophy, the evolving Buddhist perspective, and the kind of mind that is needed to sort of summarize this into pithy poetry in a way that conveys an entire biography is just simply magnificent. So let me just read you a bit of the passage that I mean. This is from book the first of the original Light of Asia, and I'll just read you a tiny bit, okay, where he says, "After me repeat your numeration till we reach the lakh, 1, 2, 3, 4 to 10, and then by tens to hundreds, thousands. After him the child named digits, decades, centuries, no paused. The round lakh reached but softly murmured on. Then comes the Koti, nahut, ninnahut, Khamba, viskhamba, abab, attata, to kumuds, gundhikas, and utpalas, by pundarikas and to padumas, which last is how you count the utmost grains of Hastagiri, ground to finest dust. But beyond that, enumeration is the Katha, used to count the stars of night, the Koti-Katha for the ocean drops, Ingga, the calculus of circulars, Sarvanikchepa, by the which you deal with all the sands of Gunga, till we come to Antah-Kalpas, where the unit is the sands of 10 crore Gungas. If one seeks more comprehensive scale, the arithmic mounts by the Asankya, which is the tale of all the drops that in 10,000 years would fall on all the worlds by daily rain, thence unto Mahakalpas, by the which the gods compute their future and their past." Beautiful passage. This is in book the first. I know book the 8th is far more valued and delighted in, but I just love the book the first because I think it has the greatest exposition of Arnold's own just immense knowledge of Hindu culture. And if you read this passage from Ramesh's book on how he wrote the book in scraps and papers and sort of collecting it, as he went in the middle of entire conversations happening around him, you have to wonder what depth of knowledge this man had, how he could carry, what he understood of Indic philosophy in his mind and synthesize it in this way. And so, we do, especially in these times, I think we speak of our colonized past, with such ease. But we also have to give credit to men like Max Muller or Edwin Arnold, who engaged with, immersed themselves in, and truly understood the culture that they were operating in. And that is what Ramesh sort of gives you a beautiful, description of. I will jump now to his first chapter, which he calls A First Word, because of course the foreword is by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I would ask you not to skip the first word if you are a reader who sometimes, like me, skips the initial preambles. It's a beautiful chapter because it tells you what immense influence this poem has had. This biography is of an epic poem written in blank verse and first published in London in July 1879. On its release, it immediately took England by storm, and soon thereafter Europe and America too was stirred by it. The epidemic of exuberance for it would spread to other parts of the world and last a few decades. The book captivated an Indian monk who remains an iconic personality, Swami Vivekananda. At about the same time, it deeply moved a young man in Colombo who has become famous in history as Anagarika Dharmapala. It caught the attention of an aspiring Indian lawyer in London in 1889. This man later became immortal as Mahatma Gandhi. A few years hence, it impacted a teenager in Allahabad who would in 1947 become the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. 2 copies of the book adorn the bookshelves of B.R. Ambedkar, the prime architect of the Indian Constitution. It informed the work of men who were active in the movement for social justice, especially in South India in the earlier part of the 20th century. I presume he means Periyar, though I don't understand why he didn't mention them by name, like South Indians don't count, we do. The book had a marked influence on at least 11 literary personalities from across the world. 5 of them were Nobel laureates: Rudyard Kipling in 1907, Rabindranath Tagore in 1913, William Butler Yeats in 1923, Ivan Bunin in 1933, and T.S. Eliot in 1948. The other 6 are legendary figures: Herman Melville, Leo Tolstoy, Lafcadio Hearn, D.H. Lawrence, John Masefield, and Jose Luis Borges. It opened new frontiers for Joseph Campbell later to become one of the world's leading authorities on comparative mythology. And then there's the world of science: C.V. Raman, Dmitri Mendeleev, Andrew Carnegie, Herbert Kitchener, Alfred Nobel. The just range of influence, is Raymond Chandler is just beyond imagination. James Joyce. It speaks to the relatability of an extremely complex idiom by which a mind is advanced as Edwin Arnold's translated an highly complex philosophy, as Ramesh explains in the book. Edwin Arnold was a quintessential Victorian in every way, a remarkable polyglot. He was conversant in Greek, Latin, Arabic, Turkish, French, German, Japanese, Hebrew, Persian, Sanskrit, and Marathi. For about 40 years, he was a leader writer for London's newspaper, The Daily Telegraph. He was a firm believer in the civilizing mission of the British Empire, but he was also at the same time an ardent Indophile. He spent 2.5 years in India between late 1857 and mid-1860 as the first principal of what became the famed Deccan College in Pune. His views on education for the natives were progressive by the standards of those times. He returned to India in Ceylon for 100 days in late 1885 and left a vivid account of this trip, which even today makes for riveting reading. He wrote a large number of books, which were mostly translations of Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit classics. So definitely do sort of spend your time with this book. There is just one more passage from it that I would read to you, but I just wanted to interject to say, at this time when we are sort of revisiting our history in so many ways that are valid and invalid, we're questioning essentially the lens by which India has been seen. It is important also that we take back the narrative as Indians of our history, of our figures of influence, and but it's also necessary to go back and consider the time, consider the influences, the context, the war, how people translated us into their dialect. It's a different matter that we adopted only their dialect as our own. But also perhaps when we make these comparisons, we sort of contextualize the past that we compare the present to, and maybe look at the past with a little bit more kindness and understanding of the ways in which people were trying their best to operate with their own limitations of where they came from. But so for having said which, there is definitely a reference to the current happenings of our time referenced in the book, and I think this discovery of Bodh Gaya is so important, and the restoration of it to Buddhist hands, which was in no small part thanks to Edwin Arnold, in a peaceful manner, which of course brings to mind the current battles over holy birthplaces that are taking place in our courts in our country, and managing to dig up a bit of ill will. Ramesh touches upon this in two parts. First, where he explains in his first word that two recent events rekindled his memories of the poem. One was going through correspondence between Churchill and Nehru, where the book was referenced. And the second, he says, is contemporary Indian politics has been impacted hugely by the dispute over the birthplace of Lord Ram, the mythological hero of the epic Ramayana. For over 4.5 centuries, the mosque stood at the site purported to be his birthplace in the town of Ayodhya. That mosque was demolished by rampaging mobs on 6 December 1992. After a protracted legal battle, Hindu organizations got possession of the site in November 2019. A temple is now under construction there. Between 1886 and 1953, there was a somewhat similar dispute over the ownership of a temple at Bodh Gaya, where Siddhartha Gautama received enlightenment and became the Buddha. With his visit to this holy site in 1886, Sir Edwin Arnold lit the spark for a long battle between a Hindu sect that had been in control of the temple since the 17th century and the Sri Lankan monk Anagarika Dharmapala, the founder of the Mahabodhi Society. With Sir Edwin's backing, Dharmapala launched the struggle to recover Buddhist control over Bodh Gaya from Hindu ownership. The dispute was finally resolved only in 1953, but peacefully. As you read into the book, around chapter 15 onwards, you'll come to more detailed descriptions of how the agitation to reclaim Bodh Gaya by the Buddhists was launched, what role Arnold played in it, and how beautifully, peacefully the dispute was sorted by Nehru, by the Legislative Assembly, by the extremely gracious handing over process by the Mahants of the Hindu temple that stood in his place. It gives you a beautiful insight into how these history is so cyclical. One thing comes up, something comes up in its place. It completely depends on causes and conditions, who is in charge, what power comes to the forefront, what recedes to the background. But really, the way this handing over has been described, there is such peace, there is such goodness that has come out of it, such furthering of the cause of both Buddhists and Hindus. There's only grace on both sides. And I think these are essential chapters for us as a nation to read at this time. What I will sort of read to you, I won't read all of that. It's a bit complex and needs some sort of mature savoring. But I will read to you the passage. This is around page 119. When Anil first visits Bodh Gaya and the impression it leaves on him. Arnold spent time in Delhi visiting landmarks associated with the 1857 First War of Independence. He made it a point to go to nearby Panipat to be on soil consecrated to the legendary history of India. I just want to interrupt my narrative, the excerpt here, to sort of say in Buddhism especially, we have this concept of, Buddhism and Hinduism of rebirth. And this sort of love of India, the love of the spiritual essence, just is something that draws people we know from all over the world. It has been for centuries, it will always be. This is what is India's mainstay. And the word tolerance has been hugely denigrated in the past decade. But it is not so much tolerance as sort of understanding this universality of the love for what India has to give, and that we probably have savored or hankered for in some lifetime past. For instance, I have a guru, a Rinpoche, who says, whenever I am in India and a cow passes me by on the street, I wonder if the great-great-great-grandmother of that cow ever gave milk to the Buddha. And I touch her with reverence because I think she's so precious. And when you think like this is a kind of thinking that's only possible in India, and which makes us understand the love that people have had for us, our work, our spirituality, our literature, our knowledge through centuries, and that by default should make us far more compassionate and kind people. I'm continuing the excerpt. He writes of Panipat as a town dating back to the Mahabharata, and in modern times a place where 3 decisive military battles took place in 1526, 1556 and 1761. But he was upset that nobody could identify where exactly those decisive encounters happened, and in wrath and bitter disappointment wrote the following lines on the walls of the Sauli Road bungalow near Panipat. From Delhi unto Panipat I came, to view those fields of immemorial fame, where 3 times Asia was lost and won, and Bhagavad Gita told to Pritha's son. But where on Kurukshetra that was taught, none knew, nor if those famous fields were fought. Therefore, bethinking what a dream is fame, from Panipat to Delhi I came. From history's point of view, his visit to Bodh Gaya, or Bodh Gaya, as he calls it, was the most fateful. Chapter 14 of India Revisited is called Benares and the Land of the Light of Asia, and covers his trip to the major Buddhist sites of Sarnath and Bodh Gaya, apart from Rajgir. Arnold writes, Benares, the Oxford and Canterbury of India, has been a city of sanctity and learning ages out of mind. Yet it is not Hinduism which, to my mind at least, chiefly consecrates Benares. The divine memory of the founder of Buddhism broods all over the country hereabouts. Modern Brahmanism is really Buddhism in a Shastri's robe and sacred thread. Shankaracharya and his priests expelled the brethren of the yellow robe from India, but the spirit of Shakyamuni's teaching remained unbanished, just as Greece conquered her conqueror. Buddhism ought surely to be esteemed more interesting than the most ornate Brahmanic temples or the proudest and most mosques and palaces of the Mughal. And all the country of the Buddhist chronicles may be visited within a week. Bhuila, which is the ancient Kapilavastu, the place of his birth, Kasya, that of his death, Sarnath near Benares, which is the ancient Isipatna, where he preached, and Buddha-Gaya, where upon a spot known to a rood to a yard of ground, this lofty and tender teacher elaborated in solitude that statement of belief which, rightly comprehended, is so full of love, of hope, of peace, and of philosophic truth. It is at Buddha-Gaya, that most hallowed spot, where under the Bodhi tree the Sun of Truth rose for Prince Siddhartha, that Arnold feels the most depressed and anguished. He views the lofty temple built in tiers or stages and adorned with seated figures of Buddha, and calls it the great central shrine of the gentle faith. Then he uses a term for it which would cause endless political controversy for the next half a century and more. He calls the shrine the Mecca of Buddhism. Arnold goes on. Inside the adytum of the temple is a seated Buddha, gilt and inscribed, before which were fluttering numberless gilded ribbons, while the granite floor was carved with votive inscriptions and desecrated in the middle by the Brahmins who have usurped the place with a stone lingam. Buddha is unknown and unhonored upon his own ground by the Shaivites. It was strange to see these votaries of Mahadev rolling sacrificial cakes, pindas, and repeating mantras on the spot Shakyamuni attained so much higher religious insight. Painful it certainly is to one who realizes the immense significance of this spot in the history of Asia and of humanity, to wander around the precincts of the holy tree and to see scores and hundreds of broken sculptures lying about in the jungle or in the brick heaps. And you must, of course, please do keep in mind that what I'm reading to you is definitely out of context. Read the entire history, read the way the handover happened, and I do believe it has immense lessons for all of us on how to have this perception of the impermanence of ideas that are in power, ideas, people, notions, ideologies, governments, and the way, to put it in the Buddha's words, the wheel turns. I do hope you will have a fruitful engagement with The Light of Asia. It's a deeply inspirational poem, beautiful lines, and some fantastic insight in Jairam Ramesh's book. Just before I go, I'll just read you maybe a couple of lines from the original poem itself. Okay, let's go to book the 8th, which is the last chapter and I think the most loved of the original Light of Asia, and I'll just read you his closing lines. Okay. But to his own, them of the yellow robe, they who as awakened eagles soar with scorn from life's low vale and wing towards the sun, to these he taught the 10 observances, the Dasashil, and how a mendicant must know the 3 doors and the triple thoughts, the 6-fold states of mind, the 5-fold powers, the 8 high gates of purity, the modes of understanding, Iddhi, Upeksha, the 5 great meditations which are food sweeter than Amrit for the holy soul, the jhanas and the 3 chief refuges. Also he taught his own how they should dwell, how live free from the snares of love and wealth, what eat and drink and carry, 3 plain cloths, yellow, of stitched stuff, worn with shoulder bare, a girdle, arms bowl, strainer. Thus he laid the great foundations of our Sangha well, that noble order of the yellow robe, which to this day standeth to help the world. So all that night he spake, teaching the law, and on no eyes fell sleep, for they who heard rejoiced with tireless joy. Also the king, when this was finished, rose upon his throne, and with bared feet bowed low before his son, kissing his hem, and said, Take me, O son, lowest and least of all thy company, And sweet Yashodhara, all happy now, cried, Give to Rahula, thou blessed one, the treasure of the kingdom of thy word for this inheritance. Thus passed these three into the path. Here endeth what I write, who love the Master for his love of us, a little knowing, little have I told, touching the teacher and the ways of peace. 45 reigns thereafter showed he those in many lands and many tongues, and gave our Asia light that still is beautiful, conquering the world with spirit of strong grace, all which is written in the holy books, and where he passed and what proud emperors carved his sweet words upon the rocks and caves, and how in fullness of the times it fell. The Buddha died, the great Tathagato, even as a man amongst men, fulfilling all, and how 1,000,000 crores since then have trod the path which leads whither he went, unto nirvana where the silence lives. Our blessed Lord, O High Deliverer, forgive this feeble script which doth thee wrong, measuring with little wit thy lofty love. Ah, lover, brother, guide, lamp of the law, I take my refuge in thee, thy name and thee. I take my refuge in thy order. Om. The dew is on the lotus, rise, great sun, and lift my leaf and mix me with the wave. Om Mani Padme Hum. The sunrise comes. The dewdrop slips into the shining sea. The end. Thank you for sticking with me and thank you for listening.